After completing your data inventory, you should have discovered a myriad of data flows inside and outside your organization. The next step is we need to classify the sensitivity around these data. Welcome back to the Privacy PowerUp series. I'm Paul Iagnocco, and I head up our customer enablement team here at TrustArc. So what is this data classification? Data classification is the practice of organizing and categorizing data elements according to predefined criteria. Classifying data is instrumental in promoting sound risk management, ensuring appropriate security measures, and achieving regulatory compliance. So what are the outcomes, if you will, for doing this work? Essentially, we're trying to help your organization effectively understand what are the data types that are available and collected by your organization. What are the various locations this data resides? You need to understand whether or not the current handling and the processing of these activities adhere to laws and regulations. And finally, what access, integrity, protection levels are needed for specific data types. Kind of a quick sidebar here, if I could. Your InfoSec team is likely to refer to this last bullet as a CIA triad. So when we talk about access, integrity, and security or protection, these are the core principles of what your InfoSec team would call confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or again, CIA for your organization. However, before you can bucket these data types into your data inventory, you need to define and align on what these buckets are or what these categories are per se. Another personal recommendation here would be complete this data classification and categorization exercise with your information security team. After all, they already have the organizational remit or mandate to secure all your enterprise data, regardless of being structured or not, or personally identifiable or not. So it makes sense to work in conjunction with your information security team. This effort will ensure that your organization's strategy and security objectives are shared and aligned, along with their specific data classification categories and their definitions. Moreover, this collaboration helps to optimize security investments. By focusing on what specific data requires those extra layers of security versus other data that may be less sensitive and thus not require the extra layers of security. And of course, by doing this, you actually deliver some cost savings back to your organization. So let's get going. So let's talk about step one. Define your data classification categories and their definitions. Very often, there are 4 common categories and definitions in use today: public data, private or confidentiality data, sensitive data, and then the highly sensitive data. So let's break them down by definition. Public data is defined as data that, if breached, would not have a significant impact on organizations' activities or objectives. Private or confidential data is defined as data that, if breached, would have a low impact on organizations' activities and or their objectives. Sensitive data is defined as data that, if breached, would have a minimum impact on the organization's activities or objectives. And then finally, the 4th category, highly sensitive data, is defined as data that, if breached, would have a very high impact on the organization's activities or objectives. While these categories and broad definitions apply in a general sense, I prefer to kind of rethink these and refine these definitions, if you will, to better align with privacy per se. So below are the 4 data classifications that we just mentioned, but viewed through the lens of a privacy professional. Public data would then be any data that has been expressly made through public reporting, disclosures required by law or regulation, or expressly authorized by the individual or organization to whom these data relate. So think about public data here being information that's online, right? And we typically see our first names, our last names, maybe our emails, postal address, zip codes, all of these things are in the public domain. It does not mean it's not personal. It's just not sensitive in the sense that we classify other things. So the next bucket, private or confidential data, would be personal information that's protected by privacy and data protection laws, and for which the loss, misuse, or unauthorized access, disclosure, alteration, or destruction is likely to result in some low to medium risk to the individuals for whom the data is related, as well as the organization doing the processing. So think of things like salary, maybe you're in financial investment, your height, your weight. These are attributes that are confidential, certainly private, but still not of very high risk to the individual. The next item on the list would be sensitive data, or personal information that is either subject to additional protection or obligations of specific privacy and data protection laws, for which the loss, the misuse, unauthorized access, the disclosure, alteration, or destruction is likely to result in a high risk for the individuals to whom those data relate, as well as the organizations that are processing those data. So in this category of sensitive data, think about passport numbers, social security numbers, national ID numbers, financial accounts, credit cards, geolocation data, specifically much more concrete and defined geolocation data. Those are all elements of the sensitive data categorization. The next group and final group would be highly sensitive data. And if we were referring to, in this case, EU's GDPR, these would often be viewed as the special categories of data, which are often recognized as having potentially significant risk for the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. In this case, we're looking at race, we're looking at nationality, religion, ethnicity, labor affiliation, medical diagnosis, conditions, whatever, political parties, things of that sort that are classified and considered highly sensitive should these things get exposed without our permission. So now that you have a common alignment on data categories and their definitions, we can now finish this exercise by putting various data elements into their rightful buckets or these 4 categories. To simplify this process, I recommend creating a simple table that plots left to right the data elements so that we're looking at, again, specific elements like first name, last name, postal address, those types of things. And then what I call the data grouping. And these are the broader buckets, right, of all the information I just mentioned, first name, last name, postal address. That's referred to often as contact information. We have financial information, and you may have medical information, those types of things. Again, what classifies the grouping of more than one data element? That's the data grouping. The next piece on the far right is data classification. And data classification in this situation is based on, again, as we discussed momentarily, whether that is information is classified as being public, is it sensitive, is it highly sensitive, is it confidential, and so forth. So again, what we're looking for here is What are all the data elements, sometimes referred to as attributes? How are they grouped together in like sensitivity? And then the last piece is data classification, is really looking at that level of sensitivity should it get exposed. Once you have a table in place, go ahead and complete your exercise. Grab your records or processing activities, or ROPAs, and begin to list the data types in common groupings and how your organization classifies these data types. Congratulations! Once you have taken the initial ROPAs from your data inventory and used them to identify all the data types being processed inside and outside your organization, and of course finally bucketed each one of these into a specific data classification, that will be the information needed to inform your security team on how best secure these data and hopefully find some cost savings along the way. That's all for this segment of the Privacy PowerUp series. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go back and watch the previous videos in this series, especially the following: assess the risk before it hits, contracts that count, sell, share, or beware, vendor management, and finally, tracing technologies untangled. Otherwise, next up to help you power up is incident incoming. Now what? On behalf of TrustArc, thanks for watching.